What's up, Internet? My name is Andrew S. Klug, also known as Atomic Space Kitten, or just ASK for short. And this video is called Diving Deeper on Lightroom and Setting Up Lightroom Classic to Reside Inside Dropbox. In my first video called Don't Be the Turkey, I presented my personal digital asset management, or PDAM workflow, using Lightroom Classic plus Dropbox plus periodic external backups, along with the cheesy Rainbow Rave framework to achieve a belt and suspenders approach to risk management. In this video, we'll dive deeper into Lightroom as a tool and how to set up Lightroom Classic to reside within Dropbox. Now, before we describe the Lightroom tool and its functionalities, I think it makes sense to establish some context by clarifying that the verb to edit photos has two main meanings in the context of working with photos, videos, and other media assets. The first meaning of edit is manipulation. This refers to changing or enhancing the visual elements of an image, with the goal of improving or modifying the photo by adjusting parameters such as color correction, white balance, saturation, hue. Exposure adjustments, changing brightness, contrast, shadows, highlights. Retouching, removing blemishes, smoothing skin, applying other changes like cropping, adding filters or effects. Composites, combining elements from multiple images to create a new unified visual. So for example, you can say you're editing a photo, and that means you're modifying a portrait of a person to enhance the colors, remove blemishes, and brighten the overall exposure. Now, the other meaning of edit is selection. This pertains to organizing, selecting, and categorizing images, often in large batches, with the goal of reviewing a set of images and choosing the ones that best meet the criteria for a particular project or purpose. In this context, to edit photos means selecting, picking the best images from a shoot or collection. Rating, ranking, assigning stars, flags, or labels to good images. Discarding, rejecting, removing, or marking bad or unwanted photos. Organizing, creating folders or collections based on your selection. So for example, after a photo shoot, to say you're editing means you edit the batch of 500 photos and select the best 20 for final use while rejecting the others. Now, as an aside, the idea of selection is fundamental to the process of photography. There's a great book by John Sharkowski, who was director of MoMA's Department of Photography from 1962 to 1991. And he was instrumental to photography's recognition as an art form, as opposed to merely a technical process. As he explained in his book, The Photographer's Eye, where the painter makes an image from scratch on a blank canvas by way of an additive process, the photographer makes an image by selecting it from among an infinite number of potential images that could fill his viewfinder. So the process of selection is fundamental to the process of photography, and selecting or curating from among a set of photographs could therefore be thought of as meta-photography. But I digress. Now let's dive into Adobe Lightroom. It's the tool at the center of my PDAM workflow. It's an incredible and powerful photography software tool. No other photo tool even comes close. Lightroom delivers two main pillars of functionality. On one hand, asset management for photos and videos, and this means storing, organizing, selecting, and curating. And secondly, asset manipulation. Now, a couple of notes here. First of all, for asset management, Lightroom operates on both photos and videos. However, when it comes to editing in the meaning of manipulation, Lightroom only works with photos. You can't really manipulate videos within Lightroom. Adobe has other tools for that. Now, another thing to mention here is I use Lightroom to manage not only my photography, stills, and video, but also other raster assets that I produce on my desktop system, including outputs from P5.js scripting, outputs from Adobe Illustrator, and scans from my son Leo's drawings. Now, one thing to point out, Lightroom does not ingest or manage vector files, but I still store these within the same folder structure on my system. And the other important thing, as mentioned, is that Lightroom's asset manipulation capabilities are limited to still images, not video. Lightroom involves three separate tools or interfaces: desktop, mobile, and web. And these three tools and interfaces remain synced together via a cloud-based library called Lightroom Cloud. Now, the difference between the main Adobe Lightroom product and Lightroom Classic is the following. In the case of the main Lightroom product, which was formerly called Lightroom CC, the desktop client relies on the cloud-based library Lightroom Cloud to store the assets. Whereas with Lightroom Classic, the desktop client maintains its own asset library and catalog directly on the system drive. Now, Lightroom isn't really just one product, but rather several tools and products. And it can get a little confusing, especially as Adobe keeps changing the branding. As I mentioned, the fully cloud-based product is now called just Lightroom instead of Lightroom CC. Either way, the mobile and web clients are common to both Lightroom and Lightroom Classic, and the difference resides in the desktop client. I personally use Lightroom Classic in my PDAM setup because I prefer the added redundancy and security of having my valuable assets stored on my desktop system, as opposed to relying entirely on Lightroom Cloud. Now, this video is not intended to be a comprehensive presentation of how to use Lightroom in full detail, but rather to provide a general presentation about the product and its main functionalities, as well as how I use it in my own personal PDAM workflow in the context of the cheesy Rainbow Rave framework. Adobe offers a comprehensive library of tutorials on how to use Lightroom, and I'll include some links in the notes to this video. Now, a little mention of costs here. Lightroom is available on a subscription basis as part of a few different bundles. As with any other software as a service, the pricing and packages are ever so slightly confusing and slightly lacking in transparency. They're presented differently on different pages within the Adobe ecosystem, but basically you have three packages. There's a basic Lightroom product plus 1 terabyte of cloud storage, and that's $10 a month. Then you have another $10 per month package called Photography, and that includes not only the main Lightroom product, but also Lightroom Classic and Photoshop and 20 gigs of cloud storage. And finally, you have the 1 terabyte photography package for $20 a month, and that includes the main Lightroom product plus Lightroom Classic plus Photoshop and 1 terabyte of cloud storage. And I'll include some links in the notes. So let's talk about photo editing in Lightroom within the meaning of selection, curating, ranking, and rejecting, organizing images. Lightroom is an extremely powerful tool and efficient for editing photos within the meaning of selection. Once the assets are loaded into Lightroom, they can be edited with extreme efficiency. On mobile, photos can be ranked 0 to 5 stars by swiping up or down on the left side of the screen, and they can be flagged as pick or reject by swiping up or down on the right side of the screen. Within Lightroom Classic Desktop, photos can be ranked 0 through 5 stars simply by pressing the numeric keypad, and they can be flagged as pick by pressing P, or as reject simply by pressing the X key when an asset is selected. Now, once you have assets that are ranked or flagged, with a single click, Lightroom Desktop can be toggled to filter these within the domain of any given folder and its subfolders. Meanwhile, your rejects can then be deleted from the system by pressing Command Delete and selecting Delete from Disk. Any other photo software includes multiple dialogues and clicks to delete assets. It might not sound like much, but if you're doing a lot of editing, the clicks that you save add up quickly. Now let's talk about photo editing in Lightroom within the meaning of manipulation. Now, as you know, Adobe Photoshop has long been and remains the gold standard for photo manipulation. Indeed, it's the tool used by all professional retouchers. Lightroom is complementary to and works in concert with Photoshop, with, however, two powerful distinguishing features. On one hand, non-destructive edits, and secondly, batch editing. Let's unpack these. Non-destructive edits. In Lightroom, all image manipulations and alterations, including not only general adjustments such as color and exposure, but also local adjustments such as spot removal brushes and mask adjustments, including AI-powered generative features, all of those adjustments are stored as metadata in a sidecar file without affecting the original image file. In Photoshop, on the other hand, edits are technically baked into the file, although professional retouchers mitigate this by operating their changes in new layers, including adjustment layers, that leave the original image untouched in the background layer at the bottom of the layer stack. So effectively, any changes can be reversed, but this results in huge file sizes. So the advantage of Lightroom's approach are threefold. On one hand, much smaller file sizes compared to Photoshop. Secondly, changes can be reversed in a history at any time. And third, changes, all or select changes, can be simply copy-pasted from one asset to another within Lightroom. Lightroom's non-destructive approach stands in sharp contrast to tools like Apple and their camera roll, where, like Photoshop, edits are basically baked into the image file, at least as soon as it's removed from the Apple photo ecosystem. Now let's talk about batch editing. As mentioned, one of the key benefits of Lightroom's metadata-based approach to image manipulation and alteration is that all or some of the edits can be copy-pasted from one asset over to a whole other batch of assets. So, edits can be performed on a whole batch of assets at the same time, or they can be copy-pasted in whole or in part from one asset over to a whole batch of other assets. As Lightroom's image manipulation tools continue to improve, including new generative AI fill and other adjustment features, I gotta admit, I rarely, if ever, use Photoshop to manipulate images anymore. At this point, one of the only situations where I would use Photoshop would be to composite or assemble multiple image files together. Now let's dive into Lightroom Classic, the desktop application. With Lightroom Classic Desktop, still and video assets are imported into a catalog file representing the entire library database of assets. The catalog also contains previews. Lightroom Classic then displays previews of the assets within the tool, instead of loading full resolution files each time, which greatly speeds up loading and review. However, the original assets remain stored as files within folders transparently on the system drive of the desktop computer, as opposed to other cloud-based tools where the assets are not transparently available on the desktop system, or they're hidden inaccessibly within packages. So this latter fact constitutes a keystone of my PDAM workflow, since it allows for the redundancy that I consider crucial, further to my belt and suspenders approach and the Consolidated Redundant Routine framework, aka cheesy Rainbow Rave. Now, once imported into Lightroom, the assets can be organized into different collections, i.e. albums, for different projects, trips, themes, or any other grouping as desired, without affecting or moving the files on the desktop system drive. Now, I gotta give you one little piece of advice here. While convenient, using collections to organize assets is not fully robust, as it depends on the integrity of the catalog, i.e. such information would be lost if ever the catalog needed to be wiped. Now, I've never had to do this yet, but actually I did have to do it once for my wife, because somehow the catalog became corrupted. So if you're using collections to organize, that's fine, but eventually that information could go away. A more robust approach is to use keyword tagging and metadata. To the extent metadata is stored at the file level, it's not dependent on the integrity of the Lightroom Classic Desktop catalog. I could wipe my Lightroom Classic Desktop catalog at any time and rebuild it from scratch simply by re-importing all my asset folders into a new catalog, without losing any of the organization information embedded in keywords. I often use collections as an intermediate step for the sake of efficiency. I can drag assets into these collections as I edit, and then periodically I go through and I blanket add keywords to all the assets within a certain collection. So it doesn't matter what sort of folder structure you may use to organize the asset files on the desktop drive. However, it's important to keep the number of files in each folder under about 1,500 or so. Otherwise, Lightroom Classic starts to slow down because it has to load too many files into active RAM. Now, this problem may hopefully be mitigated with future Lightroom updates. But the way I do it is I have top-level folders to separate personal, art, commercial, and video assets. And then within these, I tend to subdivide by year and then by month or project. And one of the reasons I do separate video assets is because they're much heavier. And so I can use Dropbox Selective Sync for these video assets separately from my stills. And that's why I keep them in a separate top-level folder structure to facilitate this management. Now, you can organize and reorganize the folder structure at any time within Lightroom Classic. Any moving and shuffling of assets between folders, as well as renaming files, is done directly within the Lightroom Classic desktop app instead of Finder. Now, in case of any file changes done outside of Lightroom Classic, the assets would then have to be relinked, which can be accomplished in a few ways. You either re-import the entire folder, or if there's any assets that have a broken link, you right-click on the assets in Lightroom Classic and remap them to the correct file. The next part of the Lightroom system is Lightroom Mobile, i.e. the Lightroom app on your iPhone or other mobile device. Now, while I create many different types of digital assets, these days most of the photo and video assets I capture are directly done on my iPhone. Over the years, I've previously used digital SLR cameras, and obviously for professional uses, they still exist for a reason. But after being exposed to photography across many domains, from fine art to fashion, my personal takeaway is that the best images are about the creative eye and Henri Cartier-Bresson's decisive moment, rather than the lens used to capture. And this is especially true as the quality of iPhone captures has greatly improved in recent years. I must, however, recognize a personal preference for abstract photography as well as manipulated imagery, further lessening the importance to me of capture quality. So it's all sort of a subjective opinion, of course, but to me it matters less what I use to capture an image weighed against the convenience of the iPhone, which is the camera I always have with me. So here now is an outline of my asset ingestion process via Lightroom Mobile. First, the Lightroom Mobile app on my iPhone automatically imports my photos and videos captured on my iPhone. Second, from Lightroom Mobile, new assets are synced up to the Lightroom Cloud. And third, from Lightroom Cloud, new assets are synced down to my inbox folder in Lightroom Classic Desktop, and thereby being added to two places automatically, into my Lightroom Classic Desktop catalog on one hand, and on the other hand to the file and folder structure on my desktop computer. Fourth, the final step is to move new assets out of my inbox folder and distribute them into other folders in my file system. As the name inbox would suggest, this is merely a temporary holding folder. Now, a couple of side notes here. For videos, I actually have Lightroom Mobile set to manually import instead of auto import, because for two reasons. Well, videos are A, heavier to upload, and B, you can't really edit them within the sense of manipulation within Lightroom. So I prefer to review the videos I take on my iPhone and then manually import them in batches, for example, at the end of the day or at the end of the week, instead of a continuous auto import. Now let's talk about Lightroom Sync. With Lightroom Classic, it's important to understand that between the three tools and interfaces described, desktop, mobile, and web, there are really only two independent systems here, not three. There's Lightroom Classic Desktop and Lightroom Cloud. Now let's back up for a moment. Assets ingested into Lightroom Mobile are automatically synced up to the Lightroom Cloud, and then automatically synced down into Lightroom Classic Desktop. But the reverse is not automatic. You can import new folders of assets on your local desktop drive, as well as external drives, into the Lightroom Classic Desktop library. Now, I do this all the time with P5.js outputs and scans of my son's drawings. But this does not automatically sync them up into the Lightroom Cloud. Now, such importing of assets into Lightroom Classic Desktop is as simple as dragging files or folders over the Lightroom Classic Desktop app window in library mode, not develop mode. And that triggers an import window. And this process conveniently does not re-import duplicates. So you can simply re-import an entire folder over and over every time you add new assets into it outside of Lightroom Classic. Now, these assets can, however, be induced to sync up from Lightroom Classic Desktop to Lightroom Cloud by adding them to a collection that is toggled as Sync with Lightroom. And that's indicated by a squiggly arrow to the left of the collection in the Collections panel. And that means sync up to Lightroom Cloud. Syncing up from Lightroom Desktop to Lightroom Cloud may be desired for multiple reasons. For one thing, collections that you may wish to share or publish as public Lightroom albums. For another, asset manipulation and asset selection on Lightroom Mobile. I mean, it's pretty handy to get some editing done while your kid's at swimming lessons. And finally, having one more redundant copy of your assets in Lightroom Cloud. I therefore maintain a collection called Sync Mobile, where I can drag assets ingested into Lightroom Classic Desktop that I may wish to edit on mobile. But for the most part, I don't worry too much about keeping everything in Lightroom Cloud, since I use it mostly as an asset ingestion mechanism and conduit, for importing newly created photo and video assets from my iPhone via Lightroom Mobile. So Lightroom Desktop and Lightroom Cloud must therefore be understood as two separate systems, bridged together by a sync mechanism. But alas, the sync mechanism is not completely robust, and over the years, I have experienced many ebbs and flows in its stability and integrity. Several times I have faced accumulating sync errors and other sync-related issues. On the other hand, the separation of these two systems also presents the solution to such problems. Because of the third-party cloud redundancy I have in place with Dropbox, which I'm about to tell you about, in the event something ever goes wrong with the Lightroom Cloud library, or if the integrity of its sync with the Lightroom Classic desktop gets corrupted, I simply log into Lightroom Cloud on the web and delete the Lightroom Cloud library, which I call wiping Lightroom Cloud, without affecting either the Lightroom Classic desktop library or catalog, which remain intact although no longer synced. Now sadly, I've had to resort to wiping Lightroom Cloud multiple times over the years, and for this reason, I tremble at the thought of trusting all my eggs in one basket. Now, some engineer from Adobe will likely chime in that the potential for sync issues is greater with two separate systems, whereas there might be less potential for issues with one system that relies entirely on Lightroom Cloud. Alas, for all its power and efficiency, like any other software, the main Lightroom product cannot be considered infallible. All it takes is a left tail incident once in a while, the occasional black swan where things go wrong, and you learn that you can't ever fully trust any one single app or platform. And that brings me to Dropbox. Here's where the redundancy part comes in. As explained, Lightroom Mobile pulls new photo and video assets from my iPhone, syncs them up to the Lightroom Cloud, and then syncs them down to the Lightroom Classic desktop on my Mac, at which point the assets are stored in folders on my system drive. So there's redundancy right there, to be sure, because I don't rely entirely on Lightroom Cloud, but I have my asset files redundantly on the desktop system. But that's not all. To ensure full redundancy in case I ever need to wipe Lightroom Cloud, I store my entire asset library, including not only all my asset files, but also the Lightroom Classic catalog, inside the Dropbox folder on my system drive. So there's three things that I keep inside of Dropbox. I keep the top level folders containing all my stills and video assets. I also keep the Lightroom catalog machinery. And then I also keep the inbox folder where new assets are synced down from Lightroom Cloud. Now this approach, storing not only all my assets, but also the Lightroom Classic desktop machinery inside of Dropbox, ensures continual background sync to the Dropbox cloud. Now, because I have such a large volume of assets under management, I'm on a Dropbox Advanced plan, which provides 15 terabytes of storage, which is admittedly more than I need. And if ever I needed more, you can keep upgrading up to 1,000 terabytes. I mean, for all intents and purposes, infinite storage. Now, a quick note about costs. The cost of a Dropbox subscription would depend on the volume of your asset library, ranging from $10 a month for 2 terabytes up to $72 a month for 15 terabytes, and upwards from there for more users or storage. Pricing depends on whether billed monthly or yearly. Now, business plans are billed at a minimum of 3 users. And also, with Lightroom or any other software as a service subscription, the costs of Dropbox are in continual flux and ever so slightly confusing or lacking in transparency. I'm currently on an advanced plan, which costs $864 a year for 15 terabytes, but the packages have since changed, and I'll be renewing to a business plan, which is a cost of $540 a year for 9 terabytes. As always, feel free to reach out with any questions or comments.